Hello, this is Daniel Ritchie, the developer of Project Dogwaffle Howler, but I am also a long-time Lightwave user, and I quite enjoy creating landscapes in Lightwave, and have for a long time enjoyed 3D and creating scenery and all kinds of things like that. I remember a long time ago I bought a program for a little computer platform called the Amiga, which was called Scenery Animator, and ever since then I've just been quite fascinated with it. So quite overjoyed to use the new instancing and other features in the latest few versions of Lightwave, and been getting some wonderful results using the tools that are now available. So I'd like to create a series going over some of the techniques and tricks we've been using to create these landscapes that we've been doing over here, and I'd like to just show you a few of these. You can see that we're using really a whole lot of instances in these. We not only have trees in here, but we have bushes and rocks and stones and flowers and all kinds of crazy things. I mean, just almost infinite amounts of detail. We have these little lilies or whatever they are here, all these little stones, and let's see, I think this is spinach of all things, and some we've got grass, like individual blades of grass in this scene. There's like I don't think I hit 1,000,000 instances in this scene, but there are quite a few, and it's not sure, but I think it's something like 2 kilometers square full of instances in these scenes. So pretty amazing stuff what you can do today on a desktop computer and Lightwave 3D. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the series by doing some modeling. And we'll talk about some of the different types of techniques that you can use, and then we'll start going into texturing using shader nodes, of course, to create environments that are natural looking, that are varied and have a lot of biodiversity. And then we will get into rendering and tricks for optimizing, of course, because all of this is going to cost something for rendering. Of course, we're going to use global illumination and some other tricks to get the most realism out of this that we can get. So let's go into Lightwave, and as you see here, we've got an object loaded up. It has a shader node full, quite a bit full of a lot of different things going on. And you can see this resolving on the left side here. We have a landscape, no scenery, no foliage at this point, but we have a landscape object, and it's been textured. We have to create a texture that is it looks good from a distance, but when you zoom up on it, it also has to have detail. Even if you zoom up on like an ant or something, you got to be able to see it. So you have to put a lot of care into these things. They have to look good from a lot of different situations. So if you're creating a movie or something, you might just be creating a scene that's a close-up shot, and you don't have to go to this ridiculous level of detail. But for the purposes of this tutorial, we're gonna do some of this stuff where we have a big scene and where we can also zoom in and see a lot of detail on smaller parts as well. So let's dive into Modeler and explore some of the basic techniques before we get into any of the more complicated issues. So first of all, we have to create an object, which is always done in Modeler, and there's a lot of different techniques we can use, starting with the really fundamental, the old diamond pattern. I forget what they call that now. It's been so long. Diamond frame is a bicycle, but anyways, using the box tool, it is possible. We'll just create a rectangle from the top view, and we'll Shift D on the keyboard to go into the subdivide polygons tab there, or the tool there. And as you know, we usually use this for metaforming, but there's also a little tool called faceted here, which will subdivide a polygon without metaforming it, or subdividing it with like you would get with a subdivision surface where it smooths everything out. this simply subdivides it and keeps all the parts where they are. It doesn't try to smooth them out. So let me undo that, and we're going to go back into that tool. Let's see, Shift D. And there's one thing you may not have used before, is this fractal field here. And we're going to put this to 100%. Click OK, and we see suddenly all these points have been randomized. And that's kind of pointless by itself. But if we do this like a couple more times, you'll see this is starting to turn into a fractal, or a something that looks a lot like fractal noise. In fact, because that's basically how fractal noise is created. That is kind of cool. It would do in a pinch if you had to. It's not terribly interesting looking, but it would do. I mean, and it's very quick. So if you're in a hurry to create a landscape, that would do the trick. Let me get rid of that. There are some more advanced and interesting ways to create primitive objects, or create landscape objects within Lightwave. So I'm going to create a rectangle again. This time I'm going to subdivide it. Click N for numeric, and I'm going to give it 40 and 30 subdivisions. As you see, it's already been subdivided. And I'm going to go into the Move tool now. Click on that. I'm not just going to use the tool by itself, though. Let me click numeric again. And where it says fall off, we're going to click radial. Now with the right button, you can create this little bounding circle. I'm going to set it right on the surface of the this mesh. And as you move this, now there's this fall off of this move. It doesn't move the whole mesh, but it moves just this part that we've selected with this bounding circle. That by itself is okay, but we're just creating this sign-shaped bulge in the middle. That's not very interesting. But if you look real close, there's this button that says Use Texture. We're going to click that and edit the texture. This can be any texture, of course, but we're going to make it a procedural. And for this, I'm going to create maybe, let's see, maybe rigid multifractal, or we'll try turbulence, or one of those. And now, when you edit this, you'll see, sure enough, we're starting to get this texture. Let's use a different texture. Let's use turbulent noise. That's a good one. Let's see, we can edit this, of course. Change the octaves, all that. We want to make this bigger than 1 meter, though. 10 might be too much. Let's try 5 and use that. Now this should look pretty good, I would think. There we go. That's better. Starting to get something that looks a lot more fractal, but this way we have control over it. We can create these mountains. We can create recesses. And of course, we're not even limited to moving up and down. We can move left and right and up and down, and everywhere we want to move there. So that's another tool in Lightwave. That's in Lightwave 2015 that lets us create these landscapes very easily. I'm going to go into one more tool, and this is not part of Lightwave, but I'm going to go ahead and cover it in just a moment here, and that is let's see, my own program, which I write and sell, which is PD Howler. Let's see, my tablet's complaining. We have some advanced tools for creating landscapes as well, and I'll show you that in a moment. Let's see. I'll get rid of this for now. Don't save it. Alright, so here we are in the program. It's a basic paint program. It's got animation capabilities, all the typical stuff you'd expect from a paint program, but we do have some things you can get started with, like fractal noise. That in itself is pretty dull. You could also paint this. This is not a tutorial on painting landscapes, but we are using some tricks to create landscapes. I think Philip Steger has done, well, I was going to say hundreds, and that's fairly accurate. He's done at least dozens of tutorials on creating landscapes, so I'm not going to recover that here. But those can be all found on PD Howler channel on YouTube, and I'm just going to apply a curve filter here to make these more jagged peaks, and I'm going to go and resample this a bit because this is going to make a much bigger mesh than what we need. Let's see. Scale this down. I'm going to go to where it says transform in 3D Designer. As you can see, we have some 3D capability inside the print program. That by itself is cool, but what really makes it useful for what we're doing now is this built-in erosion and sediment feature that we have. As you can see, I click on this, and these all these little eroded areas start showing up inside all these little crevices and everything. There's also a sediment feature if you watch this closely, and you do that, and it starts filling in all these parts with like dust and you know, whatever that's run off over the years, and it fills these areas in, and that can be really quite a lot of sediment in there, or just a tiny bit. But either way, and you can adjust just how much of that is in there. But those are two features that really come in handy for creating landscapes. And you could also create a texture while you're here, and this would give you a color map. And say you needed snow and grass and all that stuff, this will do it for you automatically. We'll probably try to cover some techniques for doing that in Lightwave as well, but I thought I'd cover this since, well, I'd be remiss if I didn't. Another thing that's neat about that is you can export these masks. Let's see, that's the masks of let's see, the snow and the grass and the rock it'll be exported as 3 separate masks. We can also store the lighting, the erosion, the Z buffer. Let's see, a depth map, the textures, and one other thing we do is we can save this as a OBJ file with UV coordinates. So let me do that, and I'll just save this as a test object in let's see, documents. And that's about all there is to that. Let me cancel out of here, and I'll show you these maps that were created. That's the texture map. This is, I believe, the depth map, which has the erosion and sediment built into it. See, we won't need the Z buffer. This is actually the erosion map. This is pretty cool. This is a map of the erosion. This can be really useful for using as a map for creating instances. You can have instances that are placed inside these eroded areas, which is very realistic, because as it turns out, the water runs down into these eroded areas, and more foliage grows down inside of them than in the other areas. So that's one trick we have that makes really realistic landscapes. If you're doing gaming, there's shading maps that you could use, and here are the masks or the maps that control the snow. I believe this one here is the snow because there's very little of it, and it looks like it's on the top of those hills. This, I think, is the rock, and I think this is the stone. So these masks could be used for controlling different instance maps. For example, you wouldn't have trees growing where there's rock, and you wouldn't have trees growing where there's snow, but you might have evergreen trees growing where there's snow. But you wouldn't have, well, you know, you get the idea anyway. So those are three textures we can export for later use as well. And we'll probably do more of that later. I'm going to go ahead and move along to other subjects. We need to get into texturing, and I'm going to go away for a moment, and when I come back, we'll get into texturing. So thanks for watching, and talk to you then. One quick note before we go on is that you can also create these slope and altitude based gradients and color schemes using procedural textures and the node editor, and that is something we will cover as well. And I'll just give you a brief overview of what that looks like. Going into the surface editor and the node editor, you can see that we have a set of gradients which have been set up, one using slope and one using altitude, and basically we just remap the y coordinate into a value between 1 and 100, and the same for slope, and then we subtract one from the other, and then passes through another gradient which then becomes our color. This is the color of our snow. This is the color of our ground, and then we have just another color that is our in-between color, that brown, as you see there. So that is something we will cover as well in further detail as we go along on this series. So stay with us, and we'll be talking in a lot more depth and detail as we go along. Let's take a look at some of the assets we're going to no doubt want to use in our scene by the time we start putting instances of foliage and rocks and things over our landscape. No doubt you'll want to download some of the free sample objects that are available online, Xfrog and lots of others. You can Google that to find your heart's content, no doubt. But bear in mind, we'll likely be importing from other 3D programs. 3D Studio Max format is pretty popular on a number of these sites. And there are some things that Lightwave may not load incorrectly. So let's take a look at some of the things that can go wrong with an imported object. First of all, you might want to go into Modeler and use Unify and align polygons just to make sure you don't have any double faces or double polygons that are duplicates over a surface. That can cause severe rendering problems, and it's inefficient as well. Once we get into layout, let's take a look at texturing. One thing that sometimes is incompatible is the transparencies maps or the other image maps that use a mask. Sometimes they'll be reversed, and you might need to come into the texture editor and invert them so you get the correct mask. The key word throughout this entire project is to check everything. You just can't assume anything in a scene as complex as what we're going to be creating is just going to work. You have to test every leaf, every every piece of bark. You have to make sure everything is rendering correctly, or you're just going to have problems. Now, textures aside, there's the transparency channel. Bear in mind that a lot of programs handle transparency differently. So you will, first of all, want to set refractive index down to 1. This is very, very important because you're going to be tracing through these transparent leaves. Part of the leaf is transparent and part is opaque. And you do not want refraction on that, or you're going to get all kinds of distortion around your tree that you are not expecting. That is very important. Make a note of it. All right. Other things are to check are make sure that you have double-sided all your leaves. Lightwave does not automatically double-side anything, and you want to see the back side of your leaf just as much as you want to see the front side of your leaf. Be sure to check all your color channels and your specularity channels. Specularity is another one that can cause problems. Be sure the transparency is set up correctly, or you might have specularity rendering outside of the leaf area on the polygon where it is transparent. That is another big thing you want to check for. Be sure to zoom in on your leaves and make sure they are rendering correctly. Speaking of zooming in, here is another issue you will likely find inside of Lightwave. You see these black areas? This is not a shadow. I have my ambient light set to 30%. There should not be any black in this scene. What is happening here? Well, if you look over here in the rendering globals, I have ray recursion limit set to 1. That means when you ray trace through these transparent areas, it's going to ray trace through the first leaf that's in the Z order, and it's going to stop ray tracing. So basically, you have to set this to a very reasonable level. Let's try 2 and see what happens. That just made that a lot better, but it did not eliminate it. I usually keep this around 10 for these complex scenes, and that usually does it. But let's actually take a look at how many it takes to get rid of that black. 4, 5. We're getting there. And bear in mind, there are going to be a lot more than just one tree in the way. You might have thousands of trees, but you want to just make sure this is a reasonable level. You don't want it to be an insane level. At some point, you can allow a few errors in if they're like really in the distance, maybe. But let's keep going. 6, 7. Still not completely eliminated. 8. Still a few little black areas here and there. I'm going to set it on 10 and leave it there. There might be a few errors. You'd probably never notice them. 100 will probably, well, it only goes to 64. Okay, so I mean that's for all practical purposes good enough. I'm gonna leave it on 10 though. That's about where it really is not a problem. Be sure, absolutely sure, to ray trace transparency. You do not want to have these not show up correctly. Ray trace refraction also will be very helpful in this scene, even though we're not using refraction. So I'm going to close this down and zoom out a little bit. All right, so that is some of the issues you may come across when working with assets for these scenes. Just make note of them and be sure to test everything. We're gonna be going over that subject a lot during this project. Unfortunately, we will not be able to create a very complex landscape from start to finish because we could easily spend a couple of hours or days on that. But we're going to go through all the basic ideas, and once again, we'll talk to you later on other subjects. Coming up next is texturing, and then in possibly a future video, we'll be working on setting up the geometry, setting up the lighting, setting up instances and final rendering and rendering settings, global illumination settings. So talk to you later, and thanks for watching. Getting started on the basics of texturing is going to be very important for us to be able to blend different textures together. We're going to want to do this in a variety of ways, including using a fractal noise pattern to create swatches or camouflage type patterns, and also using attributes like altitude and height, or rather slope, to create effects that blend textures together as well. We're going to use the node editor to do this, and we're going to start by loading in some layer nodes under the layer drop down there. I'm going to use the color layer, and I'll add a second one while I'm at it. We're going to select some images that we already have loaded. Let's see, using planar image map, which will be fine on the y-axis. And incidentally, if you want these textures, we have them available. You can simply copy the web address there. 4 pages of free textures on thebest3d.com, and those are seamless textures, so they can repeat seamlessly. Let's see. So we're going to do the same thing over here. Make this on the Y. Use planar image mapping. Select the peat moss texture, and we're going to now create a alpha channel that blends between these two. This will be the primary fundamental way of blending two textures together for these scenes. More advanced methods coming later. We want to be able to do this both for the color channel and for the bump channel. So let's use the... Actually, let's plug these in and see what they look like. Okay, they look fine. I'm a little bright. I might want to take my ambient light down slightly. I just have the ambient set up pretty high so that I can see these textures. But that was a little too high. Alright. So, as I said, we want to blend these using a fractal noise, which should be under, let's see, 3D textures, and let's use maybe this FBM noise and see how that looks. That should be quite good. Let's see. Maybe give it a little bit more. Let's see. Might want to use one that lets us change the contrast. Let's see. I think I will use a different one. Although that is quite nice. Turbulence is pretty much the old fallback. For just about everything. We want to give that a few more frequencies to make it more interesting looking. Oops, too much contrast. There we go. A little less. That'll do it. And we're going to use that as an alpha channel to blend. So let's go to Tools, and there's coincidentally a very nice little convenient mixer function, which lets you mix foreground and background colors based on an opacity channel. Let's get rid of that other texture we didn't want, and let's plug the color out of there into the opacity here, and plug that into the final color channel. And there we go. We have blended two textures together using a fractal pattern, and that is going to be very useful in the future for combining different textures together to get more variation in the landscapes that we create. It's going to be important also to create levels of textures that use different frequencies or different sizes of image maps, so that we don't get quite the repeating patterns. When bitmaps are repeated, you'll see sort of a cycling pattern where it just repeats like a checkerboard. For this next step, we want to create a bump channel for this texture, and we're going to use the same images, but we have to create a bump layer instead of a color layer to do this. We're going to go ahead and just copy what we've done here, but we'll delete the two color layers and replace them. So let's just go into where it says bump layer, delete that first one. Actually, we'll go ahead and copy the layers that we're using to save a little time. Delete that, move it here, and paste into it. This can be plugged back into this mixer, and we'll do the same here. Copy, add another bump layer, and paste that same image map, and move that bump into the foreground and background color. Let's see, we're going to take this color from here and plug it into the bump. Now this is not an actual color, this is a bump channel, but since a color is a vector and not a scalar, it can't actually pass a bump layer through without affecting it. And we'll see that momentarily as soon as we, probably if we make these a little more intense, you'll really start seeing that bump map, as you see over there. If I unplug the channel, the color channel, you'll really start to see it. I did have to change the lighting again in the scene. I keep hitting the wrong button. Let's see. I did change the lighting in the scene so we can see this better. I turned down the ambient light, and I changed the light back up. And I also put some specular on the surface to make this easier to see. You have to make those little changes as you work, just so you can see what you're doing sometimes. Let me also change the amplitude here so we can see this better. Alright, so we've not only blended a color map together using this fractal noise pattern, but we've also blended together a bump map. One thing you may notice as when working with these bump maps is they're not really that interesting looking. It's as if you took a texture or a picture and took it into a paint program and just applied an emboss or even just a sharpen filter. It really doesn't look like it's very raised. And we can actually do something to improve that. So let's get out of this for a moment and go into the image editor. And we want to work from a copy of this. We want to keep that texture intact so that we still have the color version of that. But we want to make a clone of that and go to that and do some image processing on it. Under processing, we're going to add full precision blur and make it a little bit blurrier. We're going to make these 3, and we're going to make the strength about 50%. And we're also going to go to editing, and we're going to change the contrast and gamma. We want this to really stand out a lot better. We want to drop out some of these darker colors and really enhance just the really bright stones that are in here, and make the ones that aren't as bright, make them kind of drop into the background where you can't see them that much, as you see there. What this is going to do is going to make some of these stones look like they're standing out much more than the other stones. This will give us more variety, and it'll also separate the bump from this texture somewhat, so it'll just be more interesting looking. And you'll see what I mean in a moment here as we plug this into our bumped layer. Let's go ahead and select that instance, and right there you can see it's gotten a lot more interesting, even more realistic looking, I think. And you might want to mess with your texture amplitude until you get this just how you want it. But that's just one trick to really help these stand out more, make them more interesting looking. We're not tied to just doing a bump map of a specific texture. Upon reloading the scene, I noticed instantly that something has changed. And going into the graph editor, in the node editor, we can look at our bump texture, and we can instantly see that one of the texture maps that we're using, this was one of the instances, has been changed into none. Maybe a bug, I don't know, but this just enforces the idea that you have to test everything that you're working on. Possibly a bug in 2015, but in either case, the instances of images we created are not being saved with the objects. Therefore, it would be best to go ahead and create an image map, save it out, making the same changes that we made in the image editor to make some of these stones come out more, some of them recess more, so that we have some better variety. And I'm going to go ahead and use that image instead. And that should now work properly. And I'll start another instance of Lightwave and test that for sure. Go into the node editor. That has indeed been saved with our object. Better safe than sorry. Go ahead, instead of using the instances, we're just going to create the images to do that. Alright, and so we've made some progress on texturing the object, as you can see clearly. We decided that using that bump map, that noise map that we used for creating this mask, also made a fairly interesting bump map. So we added that in the bump channel, and we've also made some additional changes to these stones in our object. I'm going to turn off this light shadow for right now because that's a little bit distracting. And as you see, we've also cleaned up our node quite a bit as well. We did this using the built-in compound node, which is a wonderful tool. You could compare it with a function in a programming language where you write code, encapsulate it within a function, and then call that function from other parts of the code. Or you could just compare it with a container. Let's see. That contains other nodes. Let me see. Okay, I'll go back out here. Another strange, it looks like another bug, is that this compound node I added is rendering the this texture over here. Maybe that's a bug as well, but we're not going to worry about that. Basically, to create a compound node, you just do what you would normally do. Just let me see if I have an open copy of the older object. In fact, would be the best way to go, which I do. As you recall, we had quite a bit of node things happening here. Some were for the bump map, some were for the color channel. We also had some for specularity, and that was just getting to be quite a lot. You know, as we start adding more layers to this, as we start adding snow and sand and other types of tundra, it's going to get a lot more complicated. So the best thing to do is to go ahead and encapsulate these in compound nodes. I'll go to the tools where it says compound, and I'll just go here. I'll take a look at what my output is, come to think of it, so I can duplicate that later. The result goes into the bump. That's not a big deal. We'll just, let's see, I need this as well. We'll just copy and paste this, or cut and paste this. Cut. We'll go into this compound node, paste, take the result, plug it into the thing that says new right there. It creates a new channel or a new output channel. If I were to drag something from any of these other outputs here, it would create a new one for that. The same with input. You could drag something from one of your inputs onto this input channel, and that would create an input channel for you as well. That can be useful for things like, say you needed to input a color that goes into this node, or a vector or whatever. Any of the basic types that the nodes support can be input into this. So sort of a lot like a function in a programming language. But in our case, we're just using it as a container for now, just to clean up our nodes. I'm going to take the result, which was that bump channel, and plug it in. And as you see, we are now back to having our bump channel there. So we could do that also for these other three. Now, when you're using these compound nodes, be sure not to nest them too deeply. You can have compound nodes inside of other compound nodes. But in the past, at least, that has been very buggy and very crashy in Lightwave. So try to keep it to just one nest or one set of nodes. You don't want to put a compound inside a compound inside a compound. I don't know if they've fixed that in 2014 or 2015. Let's see, 2015. But definitely something to be aware of. And never, if you're in doubt, never save over important geometry, or always have backup copies, because when nodes are saved with an object, it can, and if it crashes, it can take your geometry out with it. So be very cautious with that sort of thing. So once again, that is the compound node tool that really helps us organize and clean up our surfaces or our nodes, because as I said, we're going to get a lot more complicated than just this. We're going to want to have this plus maybe another one of these fairly complicated textures that does snow, another one for sand maybe. So at least 3 times more complicated. Plus we have to have the alpha channel that does the blending for in between those nodes. So yes, just be aware of that. So thanks again for watching, and maybe keep an eye out for more of these tutorials again, and ta-ta for now.